Banker's Bet by Herbert Lightumley, a humorous story of what people will do for money. It was a perfectly ordinary day at the main office bank of Daggerfall. Normal transactions took place, deposits were deposited, withdrawals were withdrawn, house mortgages were collected, letters of credit were golded. When a teller named Clifton J. Whifflington saw the little old lady approaching him, dragging 2 large sacks, each nearly as large as her, he changed his mind. It was not to be a perfectly ordinary day at the bank of Daggerfall after all. "I would like you to take the 30 million gold pieces I have in these sacks and open me an account," croaked the little old biddy. "Certainly, madam," Whiffington said eagerly. He counted the gold in the sacks and found it was 30 million gold, exactly. "One moment, Sonny," the little old lady chirruped. "Before I open the account, I would like to meet the man I'm trusting it to. I'd like to talk to the president of the bank." Whifflington wanted the president to know that he was the teller who had taken the largest single deposit that year, so eagerly sent word to the president's secretary. As it turned out, the president was equally eager to meet such a wealthy woman, so the old lady was brought to his office. "Pleased to meet your acquaintance, milady." "Thank you. I am Gerander P. Baggleton," said the president. Gerander P. Baggleton. "My name," said the little old lady, "is Petuva Smethworthy." That was, in fact, her real name. "Thank you for seeing me. I like to conduct my business in a more personal way." "I can certainly appreciate that," said Baggleton chucklingly. "It's an appreciable sum of gold. Would it be rude of me to ask how you came by it?" "Not at all," said Mrs. Smethworthy. "How came you by it?" asked Baggleton. "I'll let you guess," replied Mrs. Smethworthy, with a trace of unattractive, girlish flirtation. Baggleton was a man of enormous imagination for a banker. He guessed inheritance and long-time thrift, but Mrs. Smethworthy coyly shook her head. Perhaps she had sold a large old mansion? No. In a moment of chumminess, Baggleton asked if the gold came as a result of plunder or thievery. Mrs. Smethworthy took no offense, but said no. Finally, he admitted defeat. "I'm a gambler," she said. "In arena fights?" he asked, interested. No, dearie. Different things. For example, I'd be willing to wager 25,000 gold pieces that at this time tomorrow morning, your testicles will be covered with feathers." Mr. Baggleton was somewhat taken aback by the old woman's words. Could she be mad? Could she be a witch? He eliminated the latter possibility, for he had a sense for such things. If she were mad, she's still a rich mad woman, and he could use 25,000 gold pieces, so he took her wager. For the next 24 hours, Mr. Baggleton obsessed over his testicles. He checked his pants so often that in the afternoon, his subordinates feared the worst and suggested he not touch anything and go home for the rest of the afternoon. He spent the night seated, his pants around his ankles, his beady banker's eyes focused on his scrotum. Every time he started to doze off, his vision was filled with images of Mrs. Smethworthy plucking feathers from his balls, cackling. Mr. Baggleton arrived at the bank late the next day, only moments before Mrs. Smethworthy's arrival. Accompanying her was a lean, bespectacled fellow she introduced as a barrister from the court. Her son, it turned out. Young Mr. Smethworthy always accompanied his mother when there was money involved, she explained. "Enough banter," she crowed. "Our bet, dearie?" "My dear madam, I can tell you that your gold will be quite safe at the Bank of Daggerfall. I hope it will not cause you distress to discover that your gold will be safer here than in your own hands. My family jewels are quite, shall we say, featherless. and you owe me a sum of equally 25,000 gold." Poor Mrs. Smethworthy's face fell when she heard this. "Are you sure?" "Quite, madam." "Not even one feather?" Her voice suggested doubt. Mr. Baggleton could tell she thought he might be lying. "Not one, I fear, madam." "It's not that I don't trust you, Mr. Baggleton, but it is quite a lot of gold. Might I, could I possibly see for myself?" As he knew he was soon to be 25,000 gold pieces richer, he was still a bit punchy from lack of sleep. Mr. Baggleton merely smiled and dropped his breeches to the floor. Mrs. Smethworthy examined his testicles very carefully, under, to the left, to the right. At last, she was satisfied that there was not so much as a down feather anywhere in the region. While she was looking under them one last time, Mr. Baggleton heard a thwacking noise across the office. Young Mr. Smethworthy was banging his head against the stone wall. "What in the lady's name is wrong with your son, Mrs. Smethworthy?" he asked. "Nothing, dear," she said. "I merely bet him 100,000 gold pieces that by this time I would have the president of the Bank of Daggerfall by the balls." The Arrow Shot Woman. Urban legend of a woman who thinks she's been shot. So I heard this story on good authority from a good and honest friend, whose friend was a witness to the incident. I do truly believe it happened, as fantastical as it may seem. My friend's friend, Taryn, was visiting the elsewhere capital of Riverhold, or city-state of Riverhold, I guess it's not the capital, during a very hot summer, and went to the marketplace there. If you've never been to Riverhold, the marketplace is very crowded, much more than in comparably sized city-states. People from the countryside flock to the marketplace daily in their wagons and carriages. Taryn was passing one such carriage and noticed that the sole occupant was a woman, seated with her eyes closed and her hands behind her head. An odd sight, to be sure, but he assumed she must be sleeping. Taryn continued on. A little while later, after Taryn had finished shopping the marketplace, he passed the same carriage. The same woman was sitting in it. Her eyes were open now, but her hands were still behind her head. "Are you all right, my lady?" he asked. "An arrow shot me in my head and I'm holding my brains in," came the woman's reply. Taryn didn't know what to do. He ran into the marketplace and literally bumped into a healer and a knight companion. They were good people and agreed to help. The carriage door had to be torn off its hinges as the lady had locked it and feared to move to unlock it. What they found when they finally could get into the carriage was this. The woman was holding barley dough on the back of her head with her hands. Apparently, in the heat of the day, a jar of barley dough had exploded with the thwang of an arrow shot and struck the woman in the back of the head. When she reached back to feel what had hit her, she felt the dough and reasoned that she was feeling her brains. The Asylum Ball by William Jarth. Story of a ball held by the mad emperor of Tamriel, Pelagius III, at an asylum. My great-great-uncle was a warder at the asylum in Torval. Maybe he was my great-great-great-uncle? It was quite a while ago. And this story that has been passed down in my family from his generation to mine. Perhaps it's purely apocryphal, but when I was told it, it was whispered in such a way that it was meant to be taken seriously. Not having any children of my own to whisper to, and being in need of some gold, I have elected to publish my story. The asylum my great-great-uncle worked at was apparently very posh. On the right class of lunatic, only the right class of lunatics were admitted. Eccentric dukes, mad baronesses, touched lords, and daft ladies filled the asylum's tapestried and gilded halls. Still, it was a time of great excitement when the rumor began that the unhinged emperor of Tamriel, Pelagius III, was transferring there from a resort in Valenwood. When the rumor became a reality, the asylum went to a nice, calm, restive chaos. Pelagius was given an entire wing of the asylum for his own use. For though he was madder than a jackal, he was still His Terrible Majesty, the Emperor of Tamriel. The Emperor was remarkably well behaved, my great-great-uncle supportedly asserted. Of course, he did not have to face the commoners who came on all sorts of pretenses to gawk at their overlord, the loon. When one of the warders, no, not I have been assured my uncle, forgot himself and let His Terrible Majesty know that people had been there to see him, the Emperor grew very excited. He made up his mind right there and then to have a ball, a huge party with musicians, dancing, and dinner, right at the lunatic asylum, or precisely in his wing of the lunatic asylum. Rumors of the Emperor's interest in holding a ball spread throughout Torval, and eventually it reached the ears of the Empress Regent Kataraya, Pelagius's dear wife in the imperial city. Eager to make her husband happy, she sent a caravan laden with gold to the asylum, so a ball might be held befitting the imperial dignity. The Emperor picked a day for the ball, and preparations began immediately. The old asylum walls were beautifully decorated, but needed cleaning. A pit had to be constructed to house the orchestra. Servants for cooking and serving the food had to be hired. Gold and ebony candelabras and matching chandeliers were ordered. The old rugs were destroyed and new rugs embroidered with gems were weaved. Lists of guests had to be compiled, reconsidered, and recompiled. The Emperor knew that the guest list had to be very exclusive, and he relied on his advisors to tell him who was alive, who was dead, and who was imaginary. The party was set to begin at 9 o'clock. At 6, the hairdresser he had hired from Torval finished his imperial coiffure. At 7, he was fully dressed in the robes he had ordered for the ball, voluminous black silk and piled velvet crusted with red diamonds. At 8, he walked down the newly reconstructed staircase to supervise the final preparations, the lighting of the candles, the opening of the wine, the murder of the first course. At 9 o'clock, he took his seat at the facsimile throne he had ordered and awaited his first guests. At 9:30, his advisor, seeing the royal eyes begin to glaze over with madness, said, "Your Terrible Majesty surely knows that it is not fashionable to arrive at any ball for at least an hour after the desired time. Yes?" The Emperor just stared. At 10:30, the Emperor called for some food and wine and sat at his throne, looking at the open door, eating. 30 minutes later, he ordered the orchestra to begin playing. For the next 3 hours, they played gaily for their empty, candlelit ballroom. At 1 o'clock, the Emperor announced his intention to retire for the evening. My uncle was one of the warders who assisted His Terrible Majesty up the staircase. Halfway to his room, Pelagius threw himself on the floor in a hysteria, screaming and laughing, ordering more wine. My mother was good at this part of the story, rolling her eyes and shrieking, "More wine! More wine! Wine!" And in short, imagining that he was possessed by all the revelers at his party that never was. 2 days later, he was still not better. He had cut himself, and those who tried to grapple him horribly with the red diamonds of his robe. Eventually, it was decided that the Torval Asylum was not equipped to deal with the lunatic of his severity, and he was sent to the more secure location in the Black Marsh. It was only 3 months later my uncle heard that the Emperor had died. One of my uncle's duties was to clear out the personal property of the inmates after their death. Being primarily landed nobility, the personal property was often quite extensive. Several years after the asylum ball, my uncle was called to clear out the apartment of a duchess whose chief eccentricity was a propensity to pilfer. Kleptomania, I believe it's called. Locked away in a secret door in her desk, protected by a trap armed with a barbed needle, was a variety of jewels, piles of gold, and 5 large stacks of beautifully engraved invitations signed in the Emperor's childlike handwriting. I might never have gone to the Alakir Desert had I not met Weltan in a little tavern in Sentinel. Weltan is a Redguard poet whose verse I had read, but only in translation. He chooses to write in the old language of the Redguards, not in Tamrielic. I once asked him why. The Tamrielic word for the divinely rich child of rot, silky, pressed sour milk is cheese, says Weltan, a huge smile spreading like a tide over his lamp-black face. The old Redguard word for it is maloa. Tell me, if you were a poet fluent in both languages, which word would you use? I am a child of the cities, and I would tell him tales of the noise and corruption, wild nights and energy, culture and decadence. He listened with awed appreciation of the city of my birth, white marbled imperial city, where all the citizenry are convinced of their importance because of the proximity of the emperor and the lustration of the streets. They say that a beggar on the boulevards of the imperial city is a man living in a palace. Over spiced ale, I regaled Weltan with the descriptions of the swarming marketplace of Riverhold, of dark, brooding Mournhold, of the mold-encrusted villas of Lomoth, of the wonderful, dangerous alleys of Hellstrom, the stately avenues of grand old Solitude. For all this, he marveled, inquired, and commented. I feel as if I know your home, the Alakir Desert, from your poems, even though I've never been there, I told him. Oh, but you don't. No poem can express the Alakir. It may prepare you for a visit far better than the best guidebook can, but if you want to know Tamriel and be a true citizen of the planet, you must go and feel the desert yourself. It took me a little over a year to break off engagements, save money, my biggest challenge, and leave the urban life for the Alakir Desert. I brought several books of Weltan's poems as my travel guide. A sacred flame rises above the fire. The ghosts of great men and women without names. Cities long did it rise and fall in the flame. The Dioscuri Song of Revelation, bursting walls and deathless rock, fiery sand that heals and destroys. The first 6 lines from my friends on the immortality of dust prepared me for my first image of the Alakir Desert, though they hardly do it justice. My poor pen cannot duplicate the severity, grandeur, ephemera, and permanence of the Alakir. All the principalities and boundaries that the nations have placed on the land dissolve under the moving sand in the desert. I could never tell if I was in Antiphalos or Bergama. A few of the inhabitants could tell me. For them, and so it came to me, we were simply in the Alakir. We were part of the Alakir. That is closer to the philosophy of the desert people. I saw the sacred flame of which Weltan wrote on my first morning in the desert, a vast red mist that seemed to come from the deep mystery of Tamriel. Long before the noon sun, the mist had disappeared. Then I saw the cities of Weltan. The ruins of the Alakir rise from the sand by one blast of the unbounded wind, and are covered by the next. Nothing in the desert lasts, but nothing dies forever. At the daylight, I hid myself in my tents and thought about the central character of the Red Guards that would cause them to adopt this savage, eternal land. They're warriors by nature. As a group, there are none better. Nothing for them has worth unless they have struggled for it. No one fought them for the desert, but the Alakir is a great foe. The battle goes on. It is a war without rancor, a holy war in the sense the phrase should always imply. By night, I could contemplate the land itself in its relative serenity. But the serenity was superficial. The stones themselves burned with a heat and a light that could not come from the sun or the moon's Joan or Jode. The power of the stones comes from the beat of the heart of Tamriel itself. 2 years I spent in the Alakir. As I write this, I'm back in Sentinel. We are at war with the kingdom of Daggerfall for the possession of a grass-covered rock that belongs to the water of Iliac Bay. All my fellow poets, writers, and artists are dependent for the greed and pride that brought these people into battle. It is a low point of tragedy. In the words of old Redguard and Nechaea, a spiral down. Yet, I cannot be sorrowful. In the years I spent in the glories of the Alakir, I have seen the eternal stones that live on while men go dead. I have found my inner eye in the tractless, formless, changeless, and changeable land. Inspiration and hope, like the stones of the desert, are eternal, though men be not. We're going to do our second book, RK, the God of Birth and Death, by Memophonus the scribe. How RK was transformed from a shopkeeper into the God of birth and death. So be it known that the gods were once as we. RK, the God of death and birth, was an ordinary shopkeeper whose only unusual characteristic was a passion for knowledge. To indulge in his hobby, he became an avid collector of books on almost any subject he could find in print. One day, he stumbled across a tome which purported to tell the secrets of life, death, and the purpose of existence. After months of studying the convoluted logic, written in opaque language, he thought that he was finally beginning to understand what the author was saying. During this time, he became so intent on understanding the book that he ignored everything else. His business started to slide towards bankruptcy. His few friends stopped visiting him. He ignored the plague which was ravaging the town, and his family were ready to leave him. Just as he felt that the book was opening visions of new worlds, the plague brought him low. His family tended to his illness out of a sense of duty, but he slowly sank towards death. So, as a last resort, he prayed to Mara, the mother goddess, to allow him some time enough to complete his studies of the book. "Why should I make an exception for you, RK?" said Mara. "Mother Mara, I'm finally beginning to understand this book and the meanings of life and death," he said. "And with a little more time to study and think, I should be able to teach others." It sounds to me that teaching others is an afterthought to the appeal for me," she replied. "What is the reason for death and birth?" "There are far more souls in the universe than there is room for in the physical world. But it is in the physical world that the soul has an opportunity to learn and progress. Without birth, souls would not be able to acquire that experience, and without death, there would be no room for birth." "Not a very good explanation, but it does have elements of truth. Maybe with more study you could improve it," she mused. "I cannot give you a little more time. I can only condemn you to eternal labor in the field you have chosen. How say you to that?" "I do not understand, Mother," said RK. "Your choice is to either accept the death that is so close, or to become a god with us. But a god is not an easy nor pleasant thing to be. As a god of death and birth, you will spend eternity making sure that deaths and births stay in proper balance in the physical world. And in spite of what you believe you understand, you will always agonize over whether your decisions are truly correct. How do you decide?" RK spent what seemed to him to be an eternity in thought before answering. "Mother, if my studies are not completely wrong, my only choice is to accept the burden and to try to transmit the reasons for death and birth to humanity." "So be it, RK, God of birth and death." Jokes by Bootha Sunhouse. A ribald look at the many races of Tamriel. "How is your wife?" asked Zalathar. "She's in bed with laryngitis," replied Harleth. "Is that Argonian bastard back in town again?" Ba-dum-dum. "I keep seeing spots before my eyes. Have you seen a healer?" "No, just spots." It's an entire book of dad jokes, okay? A big Nord named Julgan was set on by a gang of thieves. He fought them furiously, but at the end, they beat him into semi-consciousness. They searched his pockets and discovered that he only had 3 gold pieces on him. "Do you mean to tell us you fought like a mad loop For 3 lousy gold pieces? Sneered one of the thieves. No, answered young woman. I was afraid you were going to find the other 400 pieces in my boot. During the War of Brittany, the Bretons in the Isle of Craghold were under siege for several days. After the island was liberated, Lord Bridwell found the ruins of the castle where a crowd of survivors were hidden away in the dark. It was going to be a difficult job freeing them as part of the roof had collapsed, trapping them all within. Bridwell stuck his head in the only opening and shouted to the Bretons below, "Are there any expectant mothers down there?" "It's hard to say, your lordship," said a young woman. "We've only been down here a few days." Ba-dum-bum. An elderly Breton met with a contemporary of his at a guild meeting. "Harriston, old man, I wanted to express my sympathy. I hear you buried your wife last week." "Had to, old boy," replied Harriston. "Dead, you know." Why was the Sentinel army so useless during the War of Brittany? The cannons were too heavy, so all 3 garbage scows sunk. Terrible. What does a new Sentinel private learn first as a combat technique? How to retreat. What is the thinnest book in the world? Redguard Heroes of the War of Brittany. Ooh, burn. A dark elf man killed his wife after catching her making love with another man. When the magistrate asked him why he killed her instead of her lover, the man replied, "I consider it better to kill one woman than a different man every week." That's a good one. A dark elf woman was being shown around Daggerfall. When she was shown the magnificent castle Daggerfall, she smiled sweetly to her guild and whispered, "It reminds me of sex." "That's odd," said the guide. "Why does our castle Daggerfall remind you of sex?" The dark elf sighed. "Everything does." Yalitha told Visitha that she was having dinner with a dark elf named Morleth that night. "I hear he's an animal," said Val. "He'll rip your dress right off you." "Thanks for telling me," said Yalitha. "I'll be sure to wear an old dress." How do you separate sailors in the Khajiit Navy? With a hammer and tongs. "This orchard has sentimental value to me," said Mojad, a Khajiit, to his friend, Hasselid. "Under that tree, for example, is where this one first made love. And that tree is where her mother stood, watching us." "She watched you while you made love to her daughter?" said Hasselid, clearly impressed. "Didn't she say anything?" Meow. What do you call a wood elf that doesn't lie, cheat, or steal? A dead wood elf. A Dubious Tale of the Crystal Tower by Bilbinus Gion. An amusing tale of a masquerade. This story was first told to me when I was a neonate, newly studying the Crystal Tower of Somerset. I was admiring the famous animal pens of the tower when I was approached by an older student. The fellow who told me this tale seemed to be very trustworthy at first, but as the reader will soon discover, the tale is very dubious indeed. Of course, I have told it since to other neonates of the tower in the same spirit. I offer the following for your august consideration, gentle reader. Many, many years back, a talented but poor bard was passing through Somerset looking for work. He could sing, he could dance, he could act, but no one had any use for his performances. The poor bard was lugubrious, but he still visited the taverns and palaces day after day, begging for a chance to showcase his talents. One day, dejected from more bad luck, he was approached by a tall elf in a long robe, a magister of the Crystal Tower in charge of the animal pens. The elf tells the bard of a white ape they made at a cell for at the tower had it died en route. There was a royal party from First Hold visiting, who had been promised a glimpse at the rare white ape. The magister had a costume for the bard if he would deign to act out the part of the ape for the visitors. The bard had promised himself to take the first part that came his way, no matter how minor, so he agreed. The elf promised that the charade would last no longer than a fortnight when the visitors left. For the first several days of the masquerade, the bard did nothing more than sit in the back of the pen. He was afraid to move and show the possible imperfections of the ape costume. In time, he became bored and began walking around. He suddenly noticed that the royal party was watching, fascinated. Happy that the ruse was working, he decided to enliven the act. Soon he had a performance and a crowd. Instead of dancing a traditional elven jig, he would swing around the cell with every acrobatic trick he knew. Instead of singing a ballad, he would roar. He imagined a rare white ape might roar. The crowd loved it. The party outside his cell grew larger and larger every day. One day, he was performing for the crowd his finest work to the date. He swung himself round and round, roaring and bleeding. His hand slipped, and he went flying through the bar and into the next cell door, where a snow wolf was in residence. Hackling its back and growling, the snow wolf began to inch towards the bard. Seeing no other way out, the bard screamed, "Help! Help!" The snow wolf whispered, "Shut up, or you'll get us all fired."